When I asked the intern to explain where he got the quarterly growth strategy he was about to present to my board of directors, and he couldn't answer without stammering, I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. Welcome to Cheating Story Exposed. Real stories, real justice, no sugarcoating. You know what? I notice many of you watching haven't hit that subscribe button yet. Here's the thing, we drop stories like this every single day. Stories about people who got played, got smart, and got even. If you want to see how these situations really end, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. My name is Owen, and 8 years ago I founded a tech consulting firm called Apex Solutions from my one-bedroom apartment. We specialized in digital transformation strategies for mid-sized companies trying to scale. It started with me, a laptop, and a lot of cold calls. By year 3, we had 20 employees. By year 5, we'd expanded to 3 offices across the country. By year 8, we had 140 people on payroll and annual revenue approaching $50 million. Here's the thing about building a successful company. Somewhere along the way, you stop being the guy who knows everyone's name and start being the guy who signs things in corner offices. I didn't like that transition. I'd spent years building a culture of innovation and collaboration, but lately I'd been hearing rumors. Nothing concrete, just whispers that some of our newer managers were creating toxic environments. That credit wasn't going to the right people, that the collaborative spirit we'd built was turning into a political minefield. So 6 months ago, I made a decision that my COO, Patricia, thought was insane. I was going to work undercover in my own company. Not as Owen Chen, founder and CEO, but as Owen Park, a new senior analyst transferred from our West Coast office. I'd grown a beard, started wearing glasses I didn't need, and changed my entire wardrobe from tailored suits to business casual. Only Patricia and our head of HR knew the truth. Everyone else, including our executive team, thought I was taking a sabbatical to deal with a family matter. The plan was simple. Spend 3 months embedded in different departments, actually see how the company operated from the inside, identify the real problems, and fix them from a position of knowledge rather than assumptions. Patricia would handle the executive decisions that couldn't wait, and I'd check in with her every evening to stay updated on anything critical. I started in our strategy and analytics department, which was run by a guy named Vincent Torrance. Vincent had joined us 2 years ago with an impressive resume from a competitor, and he'd rapidly climbed to department head. On paper, his team's performance was excellent. High client satisfaction scores, consistent revenue growth, low turnover. But I'd heard rumors that Vincent took credit for his team's work, that he played favorites, and that several talented analysts had quietly transferred to other departments because of him. My first day as Owen Park, senior analyst, was deliberately low-key. I showed up in khakis and a button-down, introduced myself to the team, and settled into a cubicle in the middle of the department. Vincent gave me a cursory welcome during the morning stand-up meeting, barely making eye contact, then immediately turned his attention to his favorites. I noticed he had an inner circle. 3 analysts who sat near his office, got invited to lunch regularly, and seemed to do most of the presenting in client meetings. Then there was everyone else. The people who actually did the work. I spent my first week observing. I took on assignments, contributed to team discussions, and kept my head down. I noticed patterns quickly. The analysts who weren't in Vincent's inner circle would develop strategies, run analyses, and create presentations. Then, somehow, those presentations would end up being delivered by Vincent's favorites with minimal credit to the original creators. It wasn't blatant theft. It was more subtle. A name left off a slide here, a contribution minimized there, a presentation handed off at the last minute with the explanation that the client prefers familiar faces. One of those favorites was an intern named Colton Sheffield. 23 years old, fresh out of business school, with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from never being told no. Colton had been with us for 4 months, and Vincent treated him like a protege. He got the best assignments, the most face time with clients, and constant praise in team meetings. The other analysts rolled their eyes behind Vincent's back, but nobody said anything. Jobs in tech consulting were competitive, and Vincent had the power to make or break careers. I worked on a project with Colton in my second week. It was a pitch for a potential client, a mid-sized manufacturing company looking to overhaul their supply chain management system. I'd been assigned to do the market analysis and competitive landscape research. Colton was supposed to handle the financial projections and implementation timeline. We had our first project meeting in a small conference room. Colton showed up 15 minutes late with a coffee from the expensive place downtown, not the break room. He dropped into a chair, didn't apologize for being late, and immediately started talking about his vision for the pitch. I let him talk. I'd learned a long time ago that you learn more by listening than speaking. Colton's vision was generic, buzzwords without substance. He wanted to emphasize innovation and disruption and paradigm shifts without explaining what any of that actually meant for the client. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly. I pulled out my laptop and walked him through my preliminary research. I'd identified 3 key areas where the client was losing money. Due to supply chain inefficiencies, I'd found 2 competitors who'd successfully implemented similar transformations and analyzed what made their approaches work. I'd outlined a framework for how we could customize those strategies for this specific client's needs, industry position, and budget constraints. Colton nodded along, typing notes on his phone. When I finished, he said, Cool. Yeah, I can work with that. I'll pull together the financial stuff and we can sync up before the pitch. We didn't sync up. 3 days later, I sent him my completed market analysis, a 30-page document with detailed findings, strategic recommendations, and supporting data. He responded with got it, thanks, and nothing else. I asked twice about reviewing his financial projections before we finalized the pitch. He said he was still refining the numbers, and we'd review everything together before the client meeting. The client meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Thursday morning, Vincent called a team meeting to review our pitch. That's when I saw what Colton had done. He'd taken my entire market analysis, reformatted it with his name as primary author, and integrated it into a presentation that had my research combined with basic financial projections he'd clearly thrown together the night before. At the bottom of each slide, in small text, it said analysis by Colton Sheffield with research support from Owen Park. Research support. I'd done the entire strategic foundation of the pitch, and I was listed as research support. But here's the thing about being undercover. I couldn't react the way Owen Chen, CEO, would have reacted. Owen Chen would have stopped the meeting, corrected the attribution, and had a serious conversation with both Colton and Vincent about intellectual honesty and team credit. Owen Park, senior analyst in his second week, had to be more careful, so I said nothing during the meeting. I watched Colton present my work with complete confidence, watched Vincent nod approvingly, and watched the other analysts exchange knowing glances that said this wasn't the first time they'd seen this happen. After the meeting, I approached Colton privately. I kept my tone neutral and professional. I told him I'd noticed the attribution on the slides seemed off, given that I'd created the entire strategic framework and market analysis. He looked at me with complete sincerity and said, "Oh yeah, man, I appreciate the research. But you know how it is with clients. They want to see synthesis and strategy, not just raw data. I had to take your research and turn it into an actual pitch. That's the value add. The value add." He'd taken my work, put his name on it, and called it value add. I smiled and said I understood. I told him I was still learning how things worked in this department, and I appreciated the feedback. He clapped me on the shoulder and told me I'd be great once I understood the difference between research and strategy. Then he walked away to join Vincent for lunch. That evening, I met with Patricia at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office. I told her what had happened. She wasn't surprised. She said we'd been getting exit interview feedback for months about credit assignment issues in strategy and analytics, but Vincent always pushed back with his department's performance metrics. He'd say that client satisfaction was what mattered, not internal politics about whose name was on which slide. Patricia asked if I wanted to intervene now. I thought about it and said no. I wanted to see how far this went. I wanted to understand the full scope of the problem before I acted, and honestly, part of me was curious about how brazen Colton would get if nobody stopped him. The answer was very brazen. Over the next month, I worked on 3 more projects. 2 with Colton, 1 with another analyst. The pattern repeated every time. I'd do substantial work, the work would be repackaged with minimal credit to me, and Vincent's favorites would present it. On the 3rd project, Colton didn't even include my name on the slides. When I asked him about it, he said the presentation had too many names already and they'd had to streamline for clarity. I documented everything. Every email, every shared document, every meeting note. I kept a detailed log of what work I'd done, what credit I'd received, and what credit had gone to others. Patricia and I discussed whether this was a Vincent problem or a systemic problem. We concluded it was both. Vincent enabled it, but the competitive culture he'd created meant that people like Colton thrived by taking shortcuts and claiming credit, while people who actually did the work got marginalized. Then came the big project. Our company held quarterly strategy meetings where department heads presented their vision for the next quarter to the executive team and board of directors. These presentations were a big deal. They influenced budget allocations, determined which departments got resources for expansion, and shaped the company's overall direction. Vincent's presentations were always polished, always impressive, and I was starting to realize always built on work his team had done without appropriate credit. 6 weeks before the quarterly meeting, Vincent announced in a team stand-up that he needed someone to develop a comprehensive growth strategy for our department. He wanted analysis of market opportunities, competitive positioning, service expansion possibilities, and a 5-year revenue projection. It was essentially a mini business plan for the strategy and analytics department. He said whoever created the best strategy would get to co-present it at the quarterly meeting with him, which would be incredible visibility for their career. Everyone wanted that assignment. Vincent assigned it to Colton. Of course he did. But then he added that Colton would need support from a senior analyst to handle the market research and data analysis. He assigned me. I saw exactly what was happening. Vincent was setting up Colton to take credit for whatever I created while giving himself plausible deniability by calling it a team effort. I could have refused the assignment. I could have done mediocre work. But I was still in information-gathering mode, and I wanted to see how this played out. Plus, I'll admit, there was a part of me that wanted to see what Colton would do if I gave him something truly excellent to steal. So I built him a masterpiece. I spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive growth strategy that was, if I'm being objective, some of the best strategic thinking I'd done in years. I analyzed market trends in digital transformation consulting. I identified 3 underserved industry verticals where we could expand. I created a partnership strategy with complementary service providers. I developed a talent acquisition plan to support 20% annual growth. I built financial models showing how we could increase department revenue from $12 million annually to $20 million over 5 years, while actually improving profit margins through operational efficiency. It was the kind of strategy that could actually transform our department. It was specific, actionable, data-driven, and ambitious but achievable. I documented every source, showed all my analytical work, and presented it to Colton in a 70-page document with an executive summary, detailed findings, strategic recommendations, and implementation roadmap. Colton's eyes went wide when I walked him through it. He kept saying, "This is incredible, and this is exactly what Vincent wants, and we're definitely going to crush this presentation." I noticed he kept saying "we," but his body language was all wrong. He wasn't taking notes on my explanations. He wasn't asking clarifying questions about my methodology. He was just nodding along, already imagining himself presenting it. I asked him how he wanted to divide the presentation work. He said he'd handle pulling everything together into the slide deck and we'd review it together before showing Vincent. I said that sounded good and asked when we'd review it. He said he'd have something ready in a few days. I sent him the complete strategy document with all my source files, models, and research. 3 days later, Colton sent me a calendar invite for a presentation review with Vincent. Not a review with me first, a review with Vincent. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. I didn't even have time to ask Colton what he'd put together before we were both sitting in Vincent's office watching Colton present my strategy as his own work. He'd done it again, but this time it was worse. The presentation had Colton's name as the sole author. Not even research support for me. Nothing. He presented the entire strategy, fielded questions from Vincent, and explained the methodology using the exact phrases I'd used when walking him through it. Vincent loved it. He said it was the strongest quarterly strategy he'd seen from his department. He told Colton this was going to make a huge impression on the executive team and board. He said Colton had a bright future with the company. I sat there in silence, watching this 23-year-old intern get praised for work I'd spent 3 weeks creating. Work that represented years of strategic experience and business knowledge. Vincent never even asked about my contribution. I don't think he cared. In his mind, Colton was the talent, and I was the support staff who'd done some background research. After the meeting, I pulled Colton aside. I kept my voice calm and asked him directly why my name wasn't anywhere on the presentation. He looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd met him. He said Vincent had advised him that for maximum impact at the quarterly meeting, the presentation should have a clear single voice. He said having two names would dilute the message. He said I'd get credit in other ways, and this wasn't personal, it was just business strategy. I asked him if he felt good about presenting work he didn't create. He got defensive. He said he'd synthesized the research into a coherent strategy, which was the hard part. He said I'd done good work, but I didn't understand the difference between analysis and leadership. He said maybe once I had more experience, I'd understand how these things worked at a strategic level. I looked at this kid, this intern who'd been in the professional world for about 4 months, lecturing me about strategic leadership, and I made my decision. I wasn't going to intervene. I was going to let this play out exactly as Colton and Vincent had planned. I was going to let Colton present my strategy to the board of directors and executive team, and then I was going to remind everyone who actually ran this company. I told Colton I understood and I appreciated him explaining it to me. I said I was still learning and I was grateful for the opportunity to contribute to such an important project. He seemed relieved that I wasn't pushing back. He said he'd make sure to mention my research contribution informally if anyone asked. Then he left to celebrate with Vincent. That evening I met with Patricia again. I told her what had happened and what I planned to do. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if I was sure. I said I was absolutely sure. We'd identified the problem. We'd documented it extensively. Now we were going to fix it in a way that made the lesson unmistakable. Over the next 3 weeks I prepared. I created a second presentation, one that showed the complete development process of the strategy. Every email I'd sent, every document I'd created, every analysis I'd run. Side-by-side comparisons of my original work and what appeared in Colton's final presentation. A timeline showing that Colton had contributed approximately 4 hours of work reformatting my 70-page document into slides. I also did something else. I reviewed every project Vincent's department had delivered over the past 2 years. I cross-referenced authorship on client presentations with internal project documentation. I interviewed analysts who'd left the department, asking them confidentially about their experiences. I built a comprehensive picture of a systematic pattern where Vincent's favorites took credit for work created by the broader team. The day of the quarterly meeting arrived. These meetings were held in our largest conference room with our entire board of directors, executive leadership team, and department heads. About 30 people total. I'd attended dozens of these meetings as CEO. Now I was attending as Owen Park, senior analyst, sitting in the back of the room with other team members who'd been invited to observe. Vincent presented first. He talked about the department's achievements over the past quarter, client wins, revenue growth. Then he introduced Colton, calling him one of our brightest emerging talents, and saying Colton had developed an innovative growth strategy that will transform our department's future. Colton walked to the front of the room with complete confidence. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I was paying him for his internship. He had that look people get when they think they're about to have their big career moment. He started presenting my strategy. He explained the market analysis using my data. He walked through the competitive positioning using my framework. He presented the growth projections using my financial models. He fielded questions from the board and executive team, answering with information I'd developed. To his credit, he'd memorized it well. He understood what he was presenting, even if he hadn't created any of it. The board members were impressed. I could see it in their faces. This was exactly the kind of forward-thinking strategy they wanted to see. Patricia, sitting at the executive table, caught my eye briefly. I gave her a small nod. Colton finished his presentation. The room applauded. Our board chair, Margaret Winters, said it was excellent work and asked Vincent how quickly they could begin implementing some of these recommendations. Vincent said they could start immediately with the right resources. Margaret said they'd discuss budget allocation in the next board meeting. Then I raised my hand. The room went quiet. Senior analysts didn't usually speak up in quarterly meetings unless specifically asked questions. Vincent looked annoyed. Margaret looked curious. Colton looked confused. I stood up. I said, I have a question about the strategy development process, if that's okay. Margaret nodded for me to continue. I walked to the front of the room, carrying my laptop. I said, Colton, I'm curious about your methodology for the market opportunity analysis. Can you explain how you identified manufacturing and logistics as the primary expansion verticals? Colton hesitated. He said, well, I looked at market data and identified where there was unmet demand for digital transformation services. I asked him which specific data sources he'd used. He said he'd looked at industry reports and competitive analysis. I asked which reports. He started to look uncomfortable. He mentioned a few generic industry publications. I opened my laptop and projected onto the screen. I brought up my original research document, showing the detailed analysis I'd done using proprietary databases, client feedback data, and market trend projections. I showed the specific methodology I'd developed. Then I brought up Colton's presentation and showed how every insight, every data point, and every conclusion came directly from my work. The room was absolutely silent. I turned to Margaret and the board. I said, my name is Owen Park, and I'm a senior analyst who was assigned to support this project. Over the past 3 weeks, I developed this entire strategy. Market analysis, competitive positioning, financial projections, implementation roadmap, all of it. Colton reformatted my 70-page strategy document into slides. That was his contribution. Vincent stood up. He started to say something about team collaboration and synthesis work. I held up my hand. I said, I have documentation of the complete development process. Every email, every document version, every timestamp showing when work was completed. Would you like me to walk the board through it? Margaret said yes, she would very much like to see that. So I did. I spent 20 minutes showing the board exactly how the strategy had been developed. I showed my initial research. I showed my analysis frameworks. I showed my financial models. I showed the document I'd sent to Colton. I showed his presentation. I showed that 96% of the content was identical to my original work. Then I showed them something else. I brought up my analysis of Vincent's department over the past 2 years. I showed patterns of credit misattribution. I showed exit interview data from analysts who'd left citing concerns about recognition and advancement. I showed client presentations that had been delivered by Vincent's favorites, but created by other team members. I showed systematic evidence of a toxic culture where actual work and credit for that work had become completely disconnected. Vincent's face went red. Tried to interrupt several times. Margaret told him to sit down and be quiet. Colton looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. The other executives were looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to anger to embarrassment that this had been happening in their company. When I finished, Margaret asked me a question. She said, Owen Park. That's an interesting name. Any relation to Owen Chen, our CEO? I smiled. I reached up and took off my glasses. I said, I am Owen Chen. For the past 3 months, I've been working undercover in various departments to understand how our company actually operates versus how we think it operates. This is what I found in strategy and analytics. The room exploded. Everyone started talking at once. The board members were shocked. The executives were confused. Vincent looked like he might have a heart attack. Colton had gone completely pale. Patricia was trying very hard not to smile. I let the noise die down. Then I addressed the room. I said I founded this company 8 years ago because I believed we could build something different. A place where talent was recognized, collaboration was real, and people got credit for their actual contributions. Somewhere along the way, we lost that in at least one department. My fault for not staying connected to what was happening on the ground level, but now that I know, we're going to fix it. I turned to Vincent. I said, you're done as department head, effective immediately. HR will discuss your options, but I suspect you'll want to resign. Your leadership created a culture that rewarded theft and politics over actual work. Then I turned to Colton. I said, your internship is terminated. You'll be escorted out after this meeting. You're smart and you'll probably have a successful career somewhere, but you need to learn that success built on stolen work isn't success at all. Then I addressed the board and executive team. I said, this strategy I developed. It's good work. I want to implement it, but not as Colton Sheffield's vision. As a collaborative effort from the entire strategy and analytics team with appropriate credit to everyone who contributes. Patricia will oversee the leadership transition in that department. I'm going to continue my undercover work in 2 more departments, and then we'll have a comprehensive conversation about culture and accountability. Margaret asked if I was planning to reveal my identity in those other departments or continue undercover. I said I'd continue undercover. The whole point was to see unfiltered reality, and now that everyone knew I might be anyone, people would be a lot more careful about their behavior. Which was exactly the point. The meeting ended shortly after. Security escorted Colton out of the building. He tried to apologize to me in the hallway, but I cut him off. I told him the apology I wanted wasn't to me. It was to every person whose work he'd stolen or minimized in his 4 months with the company. I told him to think about the kind of professional he wanted to be and make different choices going forward. Vincent resigned that afternoon. HR gave him the option of a quiet departure with a neutral reference or a termination with cause on his record. He chose the quiet departure. 3 of his inner circle analysts quit within a week once they realized their shortcut to success was gone. But here's what happened next that actually mattered. The analysts who'd been doing real work in strategy and analytics suddenly had space to breathe and grow. We promoted 2 of them to co-lead the department temporarily while we searched for a new department head. We implemented new attribution guidelines across the entire company. We created a feedback mechanism where people could report credit concerns confidentially. We added questions about intellectual honesty and collaboration to our performance review process. The growth strategy I developed, we implemented it over the next year, but not as my strategy. As a collaborative effort where the analysts who were actually going to do the work had input into refining and executing it. We hit $17 million in department revenue that year, not quite the $20 million I'd projected, but strong growth built on actual team performance rather than one person's political maneuvering. I spent another 6 weeks undercover in 2 other departments. I found issues, but nothing as systematic as what had been happening in strategy and analytics. Some management blind spots, some communication breakdowns, but not the toxic culture of credit theft we discovered with Vincent. When I finally revealed my identity company-wide and resumed my role as CEO full-time, I was honest about what I'd learned. I told everyone that I'd failed them by becoming too disconnected from daily operations. I told them I'd seen both the best and worst of our company culture. And I told them we were going to fix the worst parts while protecting and growing the best parts. Colton tried to connect with me on LinkedIn about a year later. His message said he'd learned valuable lessons from his time at our company, and he appreciated my tough love approach to mentorship. I didn't respond. Some people learn from their mistakes, and some people just get better at justifying them. I didn't know which category he fell into, and it wasn't my job to find out. What I learned from this experience extends beyond just catching people who steal credit. I learned that success can blind you to problems developing in your own organization. I learned that metrics like client satisfaction and revenue growth don't tell you anything about whether your team is healthy or toxic. I learned that the culture you think you've built and the culture that actually exists can be completely different things if you're not paying attention. Most importantly, I learned that being a leader means staying connected to the reality of your organization, not the sanitized version that reaches the executive floor. It means being willing to get your hands dirty understanding what's actually happening. It means protecting the people who do real work from the people who are skilled at taking credit for it. Would I go undercover in my own company again? Probably not in the same way. It was exhausting, and there are better systems we've implemented now to catch these issues before they become entrenched. But I don't regret doing it. We needed the wake-up call, and sometimes the only way to see the truth is to experience it yourself without the buffer of your position and authority. As for the growth strategy that started all of this, it's still guiding our strategy and analytics department 3 years later. We've adapted it, refined it, and evolved it as market conditions changed. But the core insights remain sound. It turns out that work built on genuine analysis and strategic thinking has staying power. Work built on stolen credit and political maneuvering falls apart the moment someone asks a hard question. These days, when I interview candidates for any position in my company, I ask them about a time they contributed to a team project and someone else got credit for their work. I ask them how they handled it. The answers tell me a lot about who they are and whether they'll fit our culture. Some people say they confronted it directly. Some say they documented everything and reported it. Some say they let it go because the project's success mattered more than personal credit. I'm less interested in which approach they chose than in whether they understand the difference between collaboration and exploitation. Whether they know that sharing credit generously is different from having credit stolen. Whether they believe that building a successful career means lifting others up or stepping on them. Colton taught me something valuable, even though he didn't intend to. He taught me that talent without integrity is just competent theft. That confidence without honesty is just skilled deception. And that ambition without ethics will eventually destroy both the person who has it and everyone around them. I run a different company now than I did before I went undercover. We're larger, more profitable, and by every measure more successful. But the real difference isn't in our revenue or market share. It's in knowing that when someone presents a brilliant strategy in one of our meetings, it's actually their strategy. That when an analyst gets promoted, it's because of work they actually did. That the culture I tried to build 8 years ago in a one-bedroom apartment is actually the culture that exists on every floor of our 3 office buildings. About 2 years after the Colton incident, I was invited to speak at a conference for mid-sized tech companies about building sustainable growth cultures. I almost declined. Public speaking wasn't really my thing, and I wasn't sure I wanted to tell this story to a room full of strangers. But Patricia convinced me that other CEOs needed to hear it. That a lot of companies probably had their own versions of Vincent and Colton, and most CEOs had no idea, so I went. I told a condensed version of the story to about 300 people. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the questions started. How did you maintain your cover? How did you document everything without people getting suspicious? What legal considerations did you have to think about? How did your board react to you going undercover without telling them first? But the question that stuck with me came from a woman who ran a manufacturing company in Ohio. She raised her hand and asked, "How many talented people did you lose before you figured out what was happening? How many good analysts left your company because they got tired of watching people like Colton get ahead while their work got buried?" I didn't have an exact answer. I told her we'd had higher than normal turnover in strategy and analytics for about 18 months before I went undercover. Probably 8 to 10 people who could have been great long-term employees. She nodded and said, "That's the real cost, isn't it? Not just the toxic culture you eventually fixed, but all the people who left before you knew there was a problem to fix." She was absolutely right. I think about those analysts sometimes. People who probably did excellent work, watched it get stolen or minimized, decided they didn't want to fight that battle and found jobs. Elsewhere, people who might have become department heads or executives at Apex Solutions if we'd caught the problem sooner. I can't get them back. I can't give them the careers they might have had with us. All I can do is make sure it doesn't keep happening. After my talk, about a dozen CEOs approached me privately. They said variations of the same thing. They suspected they had similar problems in their organizations. They'd heard rumors or seen concerning patterns. But they didn't know how to investigate without destroying trust or creating paranoia. They asked for advice. I told them all the same thing. You don't necessarily need to go undercover the way I did, but you do need to create systems where problems surface before they become entrenched. Anonymous feedback mechanisms that actually get reviewed. Exit interviews conducted by someone outside the department who can spot patterns. Regular skip-level meetings where you talk to people 2 or 3 levels below your direct reports. Metrics that measure not just output, but how that output gets created and credited. Most importantly, you need to believe that these problems can exist in your company even if you don't want them to. Even if you've built a great culture. Even if your metrics look good. Bad actors are excellent at hiding in plain sight, especially when they're producing results that make their managers look good. One CEO asked me if I thought Colton was a bad person or just young and stupid. I thought about it and said I honestly didn't know. Maybe he'd been taught that this was how you got ahead in business. Maybe he'd watched other people do it and learned the wrong lessons. Maybe he was just arrogant enough to think he deserved credit for work he didn't do because he'd added value by reformatting it. But I told that CEO that it didn't really matter whether Colton was evil or just misguided. The impact on the people whose work he stole was the same either way. The damage to company culture was the same. The loss of trust and morale was the same. Intent matters in a courtroom, but in business culture, impact is what counts. That conversation made me think about something I hadn't fully processed before. Going undercover had been about catching Vincent and Colton, yes. But it had also been about my own failure as a leader. I'd built a company that allowed that culture to develop. I'd promoted Vincent without really understanding how he led his team. I'd looked at department performance metrics without asking questions about how those results were being achieved. I'd been so focused on growth and revenue that I'd stopped paying attention to the human dynamics that actually drove those numbers. The hard truth is that every toxic culture is, at some level, a leadership failure. Not because leaders create toxicity intentionally, but because they create space for it through inattention, through prioritizing the wrong metrics, through rewarding results without asking questions about methods. Vincent was the proximate cause of the problem in strategy and analytics, but I was the root cause for not catching it sooner. I shared that realization in my conference talk, and I think it surprised people. CEOs don't usually stand on stage and take responsibility for their company's failures. But I believed then, and I believe now that leadership means owning your mistakes, not just your successes. It means admitting when you've been blind to problems. It means being willing to look foolish or naive if that's what it takes to fix something broken. After I resumed my role as CEO full-time, I made a point of spending at least one day a month working directly with teams at different levels of the company. Not undercover this time, but as myself, rolling up my sleeves and contributing to actual projects. I'd sit in on strategy sessions, help with client presentations, review code with our development teams, join sales calls. My executives thought it was strange at first. They worried I was micromanaging or didn't trust them. I had to explain that it wasn't about trust. It was about staying grounded in the reality of what our company actually did, how our people actually worked, and what problems actually existed beyond the sanitized versions that reached the executive floor. Those monthly immersion days taught me things that no report or dashboard ever could. I learned that our project management software was terrible and everyone hated it, but nobody had complained because they assumed leadership knew and didn't care. I learned that one of our best clients was actually incredibly difficult to work with, and the analysts assigned to that account were burning out. I learned that our office in Denver had a completely different culture than our office in Boston, and both were different from our headquarters culture. None of these things were disasters. But they were the kind of slow-burning issues that compound over time if nobody pays attention to them. The kind of issues that eventually lead to good people leaving or bad cultures developing. 6 months after the Colton incident, I got an email from one of the analysts who'd left strategy and analytics during Vincent's tenure. Her name was Rachel, and she'd been with us for 2 years before transferring to a competitor. She'd heard through the industry grapevine about what had happened with Vincent and Colton. She wanted to tell me her story. Rachel wrote that she'd spent those 2 years doing excellent work that consistently got reassigned to Vincent's inner circle at the last minute. She'd been told it was for client relationship continuity or because the other analysts had more experience with presentations. She'd believed it at first. She'd thought she just needed to pay her dues, prove herself, wait for her turn. But her turn never came. She watched less talented analysts who knew how to play office politics get promoted while she stayed at the same level despite stellar performance reviews. She finally left when she realized that in Vincent's department, actual competence mattered less than proximity to power. She wrote that leaving was one of the hardest decisions of her career because she'd loved everything else about Apex Solutions. But she couldn't stay in a department where her work would never be recognized. Then she wrote something that hit me hard. She said, "I'm glad you caught them. I'm glad you fixed it. But I wish you'd been paying attention before it got so bad that you needed to go undercover to see it." A lot of us tried to signal what was happening through proper channels. It just never seemed to reach anyone who could actually do anything about it. I read that email 3 times. Then I called Rachel and asked if she'd be willing to talk to me directly. We had coffee the following week. I apologized to her for failing as a leader to catch what was happening sooner. I asked her what signals she'd sent and where they'd gotten lost. She told me she'd mentioned credit issues in her performance reviews. She'd raised concerns in anonymous employee surveys. She'd talked to HR about feeling undervalued. But each time, nothing changed. The feedback disappeared into systems that apparently nobody was actually monitoring for patterns. HR had talked to Vincent, who'd explained it away as misunderstanding about collaborative work processes. The anonymous survey concerns had been noted but not acted on because they weren't specific enough to investigate. Rachel had done everything right. She'd used every official channel for raising concerns. and the system had failed her completely. Not because anyone was malicious, but because we hadn't built mechanisms to catch these patterns and escalate them appropriately. I asked Rachel if she'd consider coming back to Apex Solutions. We'd restructured strategy and analytics completely. We had new leadership, new attribution processes, new feedback mechanisms. She thought about it and said no. She'd built a good career at her new company, and she didn't want to restart. But she appreciated the offer, and she was glad we'd fixed the problems. That conversation led to another change in our company. We started conducting departed talent interviews 6 months and 1 year after people left. Not immediately after they left, when they might still be diplomatic or worried about burning bridges, but after enough time had passed that they could be honest about why they'd really left and what we could have done differently. Those interviews were enlightening and often painful. We learned that a lot of people left for reasons we could have addressed if we'd known about them in time. We learned that exit interviews were almost useless because people were diplomatic when they were walking out the door. We learned that our employee survey questions were too generic to catch specific problems. We completely overhauled our feedback systems based on what we learned. More specific questions, multiple channels for raising concerns, better pattern recognition in HR to spot systematic issues, and most importantly, a culture where raising concerns was seen as helpful rather than complaining. 3 years after the Colton incident, our voluntary turnover rate had dropped by 40%. Our employee satisfaction scores had increased significantly, and our performance metrics were stronger than ever, but now we knew those metrics reflected actual team capability rather than political maneuvering. See Colton's LinkedIn profile occasionally when mutual connections would interact with his posts. He'd landed on his feet, as I'd expected. He was working for a large consulting firm, and his profile was full of the same buzzwords and self-promotion that had characterized his work at Apex Solutions. Part of me wondered if he'd learned anything. Part of me suspected he'd just gotten more careful about getting caught. But ultimately, what happened to Colton wasn't my concern. What mattered was what we'd learned and how we'd changed. What mattered was that the analysts doing real work at Apex Solutions now got real credit. What mattered was that we'd built systems to catch the next Vincent before he could do years of damage. What mattered was that Rachel and the others who'd left knew we'd finally paid attention and fixed the problems they'd tried to tell us about. Sometimes people ask me if the undercover operation was worth it, if I'd do it again, if I'd recommend it to other CEOs. My answer is complicated. The undercover work gave me insights I never would have gotten any other way. It allowed me to see problems with my own eyes rather than filtered through reports and summaries. It gave me credibility when I made changes because I could speak from direct experience rather than theory. But it was also exhausting, stressful, and in some ways unfair to the people who were doing good work while I was pretending to be their peer. It created a strange dynamic once my identity was revealed. Some people felt betrayed that I'd deceived them. Others felt validated that leadership had finally seen what they'd been experiencing. Most people fell somewhere in between. If I were advising another CEO today, I'd tell them to build the systems that make undercover work unnecessary. Create real feedback channels, actually read and act on anonymous surveys, do skip-level meetings regularly, spend time with frontline teams. Measure not just results, but how those results get achieved. Build a culture where problems surface quickly instead of festering for years. But if those systems didn't exist and you suspected serious problems, would I recommend going undercover? Maybe. With careful thought about the legal implications, the ethical considerations, and what you'll do with what you learn. With a trusted partner like Patricia who can help you maintain perspective and manage the company while you're gathering information. With a clear plan for how you'll reveal your findings and implement changes. The thing about going undercover in your own company is that you can't unsee what you learn. You can't go back to comfortable assumptions about how things work. You have to be willing to face uncomfortable truths and take responsibility for fixing them, even when those truths reflect badly on your own leadership. Looking back now, 5 years after I first put on those glasses and became Owen Park, I'm proud of what we built at Apex Solutions. Not just the revenue growth or market share or any of the traditional success metrics. I'm proud that we built a company where talented people want to work and stay. Where doing excellent work actually leads to recognition and advancement. where collaboration is real and credit is fairly distributed. I'm proud that when we hold quarterly strategy meetings now, I know the person presenting actually created what they're presenting. I'm proud that our analysts in strategy and analytics, now called strategic consulting, because we rebranded the department during the restructuring, feel empowered to share their work and ideas. I'm proud that we've promoted 3 people from that department to executive roles based on their actual contributions. And I'm proud that we learned from our failures. That Rachel's experience, while unfortunate, led to changes that prevented the same thing from happening to others. That Colton's theft, while infuriating, exposed systematic problems that we fixed comprehensively. That Vincent's toxic leadership, while damaging, showed us what to never tolerate again. The growth strategy that started all of this, the one I developed as Owen Park and Colton tried to steal, is now in its 3rd iteration. We hit that 20 million revenue goal in year 2 instead of year 5. We expanded into 4 new industry verticals instead of 3. We built partnerships with 7 complementary service providers. We've grown the department from 28 people to 62 people. But the real success isn't in those numbers. It's in knowing that every person in that department of 62 knows their work matters and their contributions will be recognized. It's in the culture we built where stealing credit is unthinkable because collaboration is the default. It's in the systems that catch problems before they become crises. When I give talks about leadership now, I tell this story not as a tale of revenge or justice, but as a story about paying attention, about staying connected to the reality of your organization, about building systems that surface problems, about taking responsibility when those systems fail, about fixing things comprehensively instead of just addressing symptoms. And I always end with the same message. The culture you think you've built and the culture that actually exists might be very different things. Your job as a leader is to close that gap, to see what's really happening, not what you hope is happening, to protect the people doing real work from the people who are skilled at taking credit for it, to build something that's sustainable and authentic, not just successful by traditional metrics. Colton stole my idea and presented it to the company I owned. But in the end, what he really did was expose problems that were costing us talented people and corroding our culture. He gave me the final piece of evidence I needed to justify going undercover and seeing reality clearly. And while I don't thank him for it, he doesn't deserve that. I can acknowledge that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the most important lessons. These days, I don't wear glasses I don't need or grow beards to hide my identity. I don't have to. I built the company that I hoped I was building 8 years ago, a place where talent rises based on actual ability, where credit goes to the people who earn it, where collaboration means working together, not one person stealing from another. And on the wall of my office, I keep a framed reminder. It's the first page of that 70-page strategy document I created as Owen Park. The one Colton stole, the one that exposed everything. I keep it not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even when you're the founder, even when you're the CEO, even when you think you know what's happening in your own company, you need to verify. You need to pay attention. You need to never get so comfortable at the top that you forget what's happening at every other level. Because somewhere in your organization right now, there might be a talented person whose work is being stolen. There might be a toxic manager hiding behind good metrics. There might be a cultural problem festering beneath the surface. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not building systems to catch these things, if you're not willing to get your hands dirty understanding what's really happening, you'll lose good people, damage your culture, and wake up one day realizing you built something very different from what you intended. That's the real lesson of Owen Park and Colton Sheffield. Not that justice feels good when you catch someone red-handed, but that prevention is better than justice. That systems are better than interventions. That paying attention is the most important job any leader has. And that sometimes, the best way to understand your company is to experience it the way everyone else does, without the buffer of your title, your authority, or your assumptions about how things should work.